Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My colleague, who's been a colleague of mine for a while now, Peter Matson, is going to be hosting this podcast with me. And today we have Phil Howard joining us from Oxford University. He is the director of the program on democracy and technology. It's a pleasure to have you here. He has written 10 books, all kind of spanning the various different ins and outs of this very nuanced, important, and complicated topic of how technology impacts democracy. And really excited to have you here today, Phil. Thanks for joining us.
Pleasure. Thank you both for having me on.
Yeah, great. So as we understand it, you're starting, you had announced in 2021 that you're launching a program called the International Panel for the Information Environment.
Right.
Which it sounds like it's basically modeled after the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change.
That's right.
Yeah, great. And what's the primary overall objective of this panel, would you say?
Well, the objective is to try to put more evidence into technology policymaking. I think many of us who research or do technology work get excited about the innovation and carried away by the big dreams, and are often disappointed by how political leaders actually implement a policy or how users do things, odd things with the technologies we build. Sometimes they're totally creative, sometimes they're inspiring. But we've seen a number of incidents in which foreign governments do nasty things to interfere with political processes, public life in other countries. We find AI systems hiring algorithms that are unfair, cutting off life chances for people on the basis of race or gender, and a bunch of human other social factors and social inequality. And so there's got to be ways to take the research that we do about the impact of technology and get that evidence to policymakers so that they can do light touch guidelines that give engineers sort of goals to design to.
Yeah, and it's such an interesting and challenging intersection, right? That between good engineering and good policy development and the infinite results that might come from any combination we have. That's like a very difficult thing to plan for.
Absolutely. It's really hard. It's really hard to design for, especially in technology, right? Where things, these things move so quickly. It's really hard to know how users are actually going to implement what you build. But it's pretty safe to say that the law is always behind the technology curve, right? Policy is always behind. It's always slow, and regulations rarely catch up. So anything we can do to try to bring, like I said, some light touch public policy guidelines over the tech that we roll out before it does harms, that's the goal. That's the objective, the IPIE, as we're calling it.
IPIE, yep, that's great. Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. Can we start by I think maybe we should spend a little bit of time. I thought your book, the last book you published, The Lie Machine, did such a great job of really describe, and even the name Lie Machine is just so aptly named, because really what you're describing is this whole ecosystem between the people who generate the lies, the technology and social media that distributes it, and then the large consulting firms that market it. And this whole ecosystem is incredibly complicated and very interesting. Can you just kind of try to give us an overview of that landscape from your perspective?
Sure. Certainly. Thank you. It's you're right. It's large and it's complex, and it cuts across borders. And different parts of the Lie Machine are based in different parts of the world. I think some of the components that the book goes into involve troll farms in Poland and Brazil that generate the content. The content. Actually, most of the client base for the firm we studied in Poland is not regular politicians. It's actually pharmaceuticals firms. This was pre-COVID, but it was pharmaceuticals that would purchase stuff. You don't purchase them, you rent the fake accounts, right? So there's tens of thousands of fake the fake accounts. You rent them week to week because they're maintained, right, by the elderly Polish who this particular lab employed to keep the content flowing with flower pictures and football scores and soap operas and make these accounts look like lively people.
Oh, and so sorry to just tap into that for a second. So the distinction between renting and buying is actually critical in that sense then, because they're maintaining continuous personas that you
Exactly. In the biz, they're often called legends. So it's one legend will be around for a while. And if you say you need middle-aged American housewives, then you've got that as a category of legends that you can supply. If you need somebody who speaks a particular language, then you can block off those legends, and they'll work on an issue you care about once you've rented them for a week. And when the next client comes up, they'll sort of move off the topic of whatever the medicine is. If you're a pharmaceuticals firm trying to encourage some conversation about the medicine you're selling, after you've paid for the rental period, the accounts go back to being regular humans, or they move on to whatever the next topic is. I should say that this area of the design, the production of misinformation is also really fast moving. So it was a couple of years ago that I visited the lab. I would assume that they've moved past Facebook and are working in other platforms, and the mechanisms have probably evolved too, right? Because this stuff changes.
Do you see like a distinction between these kind of fake accounts that were generated here and say companies that are generating a fake person to advertise for them, but it's known that that's tied to that company?
Great question. I think one of the things we've noticed is that there are very few examples of successful AI, machine learning generated personas that have actually moved public opinion. So we've all seen the videos of fake President Obama and fake deep fake videos. And once you compress those files and try to put them on YouTube or another platform, YouTube engineers are able to something about the mode of compression that lets YouTube detect fairly quickly if a file is artificially generated. Machine learning now tends to be used to generate the images, the user images for an account rather than the content. So it used to be that a fake account would take somebody else's image just from pulling off Flickr or some other image database. Now they'll use generative AI to create many different kinds of user images, and that's not really content production, I guess, but it does help it. It does allow a factory that wants to create these things to produce multiple new users, and a platform won't be able to detect that the same photo is being recycled.
Wow. And these legends from these consulting groups that are main job is to sort of market messaging, those largely go undetected as well, right? I mean, especially if they're maintaining a personality, so to speak. What do we have in place to do any detection on that? Or what are the
firms? Most of the technology platforms rely on user flagging, right? So and they'll say this because as a way of the firms will say this as a way of protecting their user. This is a community-driven values, right? So they'll say we take a close look at the accounts that users flag for us. At a base engineering level, they can flag for themselves unusual traffic patterns, or if there's wild imbalances, if they're following 40,000 users but nobody's following them, then there's some of those ratios that they can detect in-house. But it's really hard to catch and shut down whole networks. There are a few of these. I know Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram used to put up a data set whenever they caught a whole family of fake accounts managed on a particular issue. They would issue a press release. put the raw data up online for people to see what networks were involved. They've actually stopped doing that as regularly as they used to. I think maybe the political attention just isn't there anymore to catch those fake accounts, so they've eased up on that practice. I think the key point though, is that from the perspective of the firm, the trolling firm, you maintain a stable of legends. So if one of the platforms catches a couple thousand of your fake accounts, you're constantly running to create new accounts. So you sort of plan for the turnover. A certain portion of your accounts, legends, will get shut down, and you need to refresh those with new ones.
So, I mean, I can't help but ask, just because of recent news. So it seems like something like ChatGPT, which is
Yes.
the big thing in the news. Where do you see that intersecting this in the most fundamental, risky way?
I'm still trying to sort out what the implications of ChatGPT or large language learning models will be for misinformation. So, I mean, maybe we can talk this through and think through it together. I think at face value, it's quite conceivable that you could ask a large language model to produce a fake story that is plausible, and then you could take that content and put it on your own website with the New York Times font and some other domain, some other base URL, and you'd get a few people to not notice the difference and read your junk.
Yeah.
I think most of the search engines are pretty good at detecting outlets that do that kind of stuff, and there are watch lists that the firms develop of sources that are just known to produce junk news.
Right.
So I guess I would say, for now, I think the implication is that more people can play with junk news creating fake chunks of content. But I'm not sure that I think our mechanism for catching this stuff is still as, you may think it's a lame mechanism anyway, but there's no threat to that. I think search in particular won't drive SEO is not going to drive large amounts of traffic to ChatGPT generated content.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I feel like like, while they can be, one of the things I thought was really interesting in your book is how you describe the skill sets needed for the group of people that are generating the lies, because it's a creative process. That's how you describe it, right? It's a creative process of people who really have to figure out creative ways to sort of angle their objective. And I might argue that ChatGPT, while they can, if you put in the right, this term prompt engineering that's coming out now, what I imagine is that the liars, or the group of people who are generating the lies, could be really good prompt engineers. And then maybe it like creates a better narrative, but I still think you need that creative force behind it. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it may seem a little more meta, but I think one of the challenges for those ChatGPT and similar services is that it's very difficult for us on the outside to know much about the training data or whatever it was that was scooped up and put into those models. So, they probably took all of our Gmail from the last 20, 25 years, right? That stuff is probably in there, but do we actually know that? I don't even know if we know that, but there'd be significant volumes of content that Google hasn't told us about that have gone into the training mechanisms. And there's only a few examples of open source models like that. And it seems to me there was one from a French one model, maybe it was the Sorbonne in Paris, that did publish the list of training data sources that had been scooped up into its model. And several known junk news websites we were just talking about were scooped up in the open. So, it's great that we could catch this stuff because it was open. But if the training data is taking stuff that's unethically collected or known to be lousy, misinformation, hard right neo-Nazi content, then how do we interpret the closed ones, right? It's complex.
Yeah.
So I'm still working it out. If you two have opinions on this, would love to know what your thinking is.
Yeah, it's definitely been really interesting. I've been experimenting around with ChatGPT in particular to see what sorts of things I can get it to do, and what sort of answers. And in general, right, what I found is it's very good at high level concepts. Once you start getting down into the nitty gritty, then you can be like, oh, well, that doesn't make sense, or this isn't true. But you also have to have domain knowledge to be able to say to know that.
To catch that stuff.
And then, like, so just now, I asked it to give me an argument that the Earth is flat, and it has bounds on it, so it returns saying that it cannot provide arguments that go against well-established scientific facts, and then goes into explaining how the Earth is in fact round, and then titles the conversation for me that flat Earth is impossible.
So Peter, that's a fabulous example, because that also teaches us a little bit about the curation that the engineers behind it have done. And we know they've already said that they've done some things to take out the nastiest of sexist content, and they know that people are going to try to punk it into white supremacists, because they did that with what was the other Microsoft, the bot from the chat bot from a few years.
Are you talking about BART, or are you something different?
No, there was a chat bot that was published, and it was put online, and within a couple weeks or a couple days.
It was super racist.
That's right.
Yeah.
I think it was days. I don't think it was weeks. So we know, at least engineers know now, that the public is going to try to test the limits. We're all tinkerers, and so we're going to try to test the limits of ChatGPT. So clearly they've done some curation. We don't know what curation they've done. And one of the dynamics here is that I think there's different expectations for what racism means or sexism means. So, for example, in European human rights thinking, gender inequality is one of the primary things that they think about. Racial inequalities are it's not that they're secondary, it's just that they're not as pronounced, and policymakers they don't identify them as much as they are relevant in the US context. So if a technology firm is going to design to be sensitive to public expectations for conduct, are you going to use the European one? The European Commission is there, right? They're more likely to enforce stuff, but they don't worry about the status of African Americans in a European context. Do you reply to US expectations, which, today I think we need to be attuned in to sensitive to racial inequalities in ways that are just not in Europe. So engineers have to make choices, designers have to make choices. We don't know what their choices were beyond this nice test that you just put them through.
Right, and then even understanding, right, the cultural context that things are being presented in, right? Because what may be offensive to a group of people in one location is not offensive to a similar group of people in another location. Especially as we talk about like the connotation and denotation of words, right? Like some words are triggers for a group of people, whereas same word, not a trigger.
I suppose that makes it an engineering challenge, right? Because there's you're right, the same words mean different things even within English, right? Much less around other languages. A good chunk of the an important reason for our responsiveness on neo-Nazi content is not some ethical fear of not some political dislike of neo-Nazis. It's because of the very specific French law banning the sale and trade of Nazi paraphernalia. It is a very strongly written law, and it's one of the things. That single law becomes a benchmark for how many other technology firms if they want to have French users, right? If they want to have access to that market, that's the reason they act on Nazi content, um,
Huh.
not some
Yeah.
not some abstract commitment to
Right. What's the motivation behind it? Which we all know, we have to have some sort of fiscal motivation, most likely for Drive.
for Drive.
Yeah.
Right?
I think one of the things, just lingering for one more second on the large language models, that's interesting to me in the future, maybe not as much now, but I think the technology, we've been moving into the let's feed it more and more and more data, and they've evolved the technology and methodologies as well. But I think we've reached a point where it's going to become more about the technology and sophisticated transformers and the specific methods they're using that could make for very powerful models with less data, which means that it would empower specific groups to use very specialized data to have generative AI, which to me is when it becomes even, potentially more harmful, because then it's targeted to a specific smaller set of data.
Tessa, that's a great idea. I hadn't thought of that before. But here's the opposite argument. If you think we'll be able to generate more powerful models with less data down the road, why wouldn't we build better generative systems with fresh scoops of data, where you can tell the provenance, where where there's unlikely to be, there's always some biases, but some of the stuff that might have gone into GPT really could have been our Gmails from, when was that service rolled out? 2001, 2? It really could be 20, 25 years worth of emails. If you started fresh with data where you could confirm where you got the stuff from, and you trained from scratch with, maybe that actually would be a good thing, right?
Oh, totally. And I love that positive spin. And actually, I love this when I read it in your book. How did you say it? Here, I have it written down, because you said it so well. It was basically the idea of using it to promote democracy, essentially. Where and that's when you start moving into, and maybe we can start talking about your expectations for the program you're doing, right?
IPIE, right?
IPIE. I keep forgetting the acronym. I'm sorry. But it's basically, because how I read it, a lot of the fundamental concepts around it are around actually encouraging broader democracy among people by sharing data, allowing people to denote who they're sharing data to and with transparency. That's really kind of the avenue you're moving into, which I greatly appreciate, because I think a lot of what I hear outside of that is strict policing, which I imagine is not only difficult, but it doesn't actually motivate people towards a positive outcome. And, that's, really interesting. I'd love to hear more about it.
Absolutely. I don't think, policing and strong regulatory oversight is not the thing we want. And, part of the problem we're trying to solve with the IPIE is that there are some governments that are over-regulating, that are going too far, right, and coming up with policies that just are not based in any evidence about how humans use technology, or how we react. I think the challenge is to take advantage of what we do know, and to surface the scientific consensus. And I think part of the problem is actually with what scientific consensus means. So, for example, there is a growing amount of research about the impact of Instagram on young girls and teen body image.
Right.
So we think there's a relationship between what young women see online and the bloom of anorexia in the population. But I don't know that there's scientific consensus on that yet. And getting to consensus means lots of different studies in different parts of the world with the right kind of statistical analysis, where you can merge data sets. So you can take your study of people in Korea and merge it with your study of Canadians, and then merge it with a study in Latin America that only covered women but didn't cover both. You can take these very different kinds of studies and put them together to identify statistically significant positive effects. That kind of, it's called meta-analysis, and that kind of meta-analysis is really hard to do. And not everybody produces research that allows you to make those steps into meta-analysis. So if we ever want Instagram if we ever expect Instagram or TikTok or any of the visual platforms to do systematically constructive things to help teens with mental health issues, we need some way of surfacing what that structure looks like, what those things look like. And I think pulling the research together might get us part of the way there. The firms themselves aren't doing the research, right?
So you brought up a really interesting point there, which is kind of a tangent here, but we're going to go down it anyway.
Let's go. Yeah.
So with the meta-analysis, right, you're kind of looking toward this idea of like a global statistical approach, right? Like saying, hey, we can say this is something that we have consensus on globally, but you also have things that are locally significant, right? Like that not all people in all countries react the same way. For instance, right, like in the United States, we have a much higher effectiveness of placebo pills, which makes doing medical studies in the US much more difficult, because your control group, right, is already predisposed to react more strongly to it.
Yeah.
So like, how do you kind of balance those two ideas, right? Like maybe this is something that has a much larger effect in the United States or in Korea, but doesn't have that same large effect globally.
That is a fabulous question. I think in the research fantasy world, anyway, you'd have a large enough of a sample size to be able to measure the different effects, and you'd put USA respondent in as a variable and be able to measure that. So if the probabilities are if your respondent is from the US, then they're feeling an effect because of and from the placebo. One might be able to model on that. But I totally take your point that these effects may vary by country. They may also vary by language. And one of the tough situations we're in now is that the vast majority of the social data science that we do is about US citizens and stuff they do in English. And we know, I mentioned earlier, actually, these reports that the platforms issue on when they take down a network. When they issue a network takedown report on, so-and-so, this size of a network on Twitter was caught operating from Iran, doing odd things to their neighbors. And when they issue those reports, we can work out what language they're operating in. And the vast majority of the network takedowns that Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook run are for networks that don't operate in English. They're in Spanish, and they're in Arabic, they're in Turkish, they're in Serbian, so they're in other languages. And so a lot of those effects that we think we know something about, we only know about by studying Americans, and it's the rest of the world that we know the least about. So this gets me back to the IPIE mission. I think if we can figure out, there's a lot of great research from our Spanish language colleagues on what's going on on the Spanish language. Same with Arabic. Actually, I think there's even less that we know about Arabic. Figuring out what works across language contexts, that's going to be part of the hard work of the IPIE, I think.
Oh, definitely. So just so I make sure I understood exactly what you mean, it's kind of like creating a international context for different areas of study. Is that like what?
That's exactly right. Exactly right. I mean, you wouldn't want to, even in the US context, you wouldn't want to impose a technology policy based on users from Washington State, Oregon, and California, right? The country's not going to like that. So that's not going to work for most of the rest of the country. So it's the same thing. It's the same thing globally. If we just take Canadians, Australians, people in the US and people in the UK, and try to impose on the rest of the world a definition of misinformation or an understanding of what mental health is, or what discrimination is. Like you said, Peter, it's probably won't work, won't take. And I still, maybe it's a declaration of faith, but I would still say that there should be things that we can learn from several languages or from several countries that probably are true most of the time, and surfacing those effects are I think that's the next big challenge for us.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I have myself questioning, because this other thought that I have been thinking about is how much these lie machines move people towards not really good critical thinking, right? They kind of start having large skepticism, may end up making gut feel decisions, really just kind of going with the flow of things, which just makes them more vulnerable to the types of influences that are then generated. And I guess this conversation sort of has me wondering how much of that is a whole human condition. Like, is there even variance across countries for that, and how that might change with the policies you might put in place with the program that you're going to be running, right? Because I imagine that data availability, transparent, and empowerment, kind of where you have more ownership over your data as a person. I imagine it has an impact on how that shapes how you're affected and how you can be affected. You think that's true, or?
Yeah, that's interesting. So I bet your instinct is right in that. Generally, I think the survey data shows that people who think about their own privacy issues, people who manage cookies, who know what a cookie is, and people who know that have a slightly they're above average in terms of their knowledge of the technology. The average person does not really manage their cookies or their privacy particularly well, and so those people are probably more purposeful in how they set up their own news feeds, where they go for content, right, and the general things that they do to maybe they do a little two-factor authentication, that kind of stuff. Most people don't or won't.
Yeah.
And I would bet, but the other thing, I'm just thinking back to your earlier comments. The other thing is that there are some behavioral habits that we know are pretty transportable across lots of cultures and lots of societies. And these are cognitive behavioral effects called in the selective exposure. We tend to take more stuff that we know we already like. There's elective affinity. We tend to associate with people who are a lot like us. There's actually several types of selective exposure, several reasons for it. We don't like new information that proves us wrong, or new information that suggests we made a bad decision sometime in the past. We tend not to like that stuff, and we'll steer. So those are cognitive effects that work across a lot of languages and work across populations. If a platform is purposefully designed to take advantage of cognitive effects in the user base, that's deliberately going to make it possible, if you use a lot of potty words or all capital letters in your news headlines, that's going to drive public learning, then there are things you can do to discourage that kind of design choice. And so there's a little bit of onus on users. We all need to be more careful about what we read. We shouldn't forward stuff that we haven't actually read ourselves. Right? There's some user habits that we can promote. There's also some design features that you can work on to not abuse the cognitive biases we all have.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's almost like you have to assume to some degree in building policies and regulations around this that people won't actually engage in that proactively, because that's probably the larger population, I would assume.
Tessa, yes, I think it's all of us. I think I would expect we all do that in some different ways in our news consumption. I have my favorite sites I tend to go to. Right? That's what bookmarks are. I bookmark them.
Yeah.
You can imagine that a healthy public-facing algorithm might occasionally introduce a random professional news site, so not a piece of junk, but some other source that from a source you wouldn't. If you're always reading the New York Times, maybe once in a while you get the Wall Street Journal article, or that kind of just to create the variety. But if you really are only tuned into one or two news sources, having a flag that encourages you to diversify could be another constructive thing.
Yeah.
We know the platforms have played around with these things, and they do try different things, especially during elections in the U.S. But it's not clear that they do it consistently. Sometimes they run things in the US or Canada that they don't offer in Australia or the UK, or they'll do a really successful get out the vote operation in Canada, but then they won't run it in Australia and they won't run it in the US because get out the vote. Not everybody likes get out the vote initiatives in the US. So it's not always clear what positive things the firms know work well that they're just sitting on, not offering everybody.
Right, and it also depends on how you define works well, right? Because on one case, right, it could be that, hey, we see that when we provide people with these different news articles that we see their engagement shifts, or that they, instead of having, mean comments or something, right, that they're engaging more in productive conversation. But it could also be that also decreases the amount of users, right, that are reacting to or that are on the platform, right? And so the incentive structure doesn't necessarily support what's best for everyone, right?
That's true, and that's why that's a good thing about having a complex media ecology, right? So if you don't like one platform or it's giving you stuff you don't see, you tune out and you move somewhere else. I have to admit, I am trying to migrate from Twitter to Mastodon. I'm really trying, and it's a learning curve. I don't know if have either of you tried.
I haven't heard of Mastodon. What is that? I don't even know what it is actually.
Mastodon is a fully federated server, a Twitter-like server system. Although Mastodon faithful wouldn't want to call it Twitter-like. It's basically you reconstruct your networks. The server hosting is fully decentralized, and I hesitate to say local, but it's got a kind of Reddit-like feature, and a lot of researchers have moved there just because the public-facing Twitter as a platform for academics just has kind of evaporated.
Oh, sure, yeah.
In the last 6 months.
Yeah.
4 months. It's more like 4 months.
Yeah, honestly, I haven't been on social media other than LinkedIn for a couple of years now, and largely for this problem. Like, I didn't really want. I felt the influence, and I couldn't. But then when I read your book, I was like, man, maybe that's not the right answer, right? Because I think that's part of what you're saying. You're like, we don't just pretend it's not there, because then it's almost like the echo chambers become specific to a particular group, and it fosters and grows, and it's also not empowering, change into a more democratic sort of facilitation
culture. And even if not every part of the world is vows democracy in the same way, but all parts of the world do involve some kind of civic engagement, and most parts of the world value some forms of civic engagement and the rule of law, right? So having rules that apply equally to everybody across society are fundamental to how markets work, to getting our food, to getting our kids off to school. Just having shared norms and patterns of behavior is that's what by definition makes society. If there's information technologies that are purposefully undermining those norms, rules, values, behavior, or undermining the rule of law, then it's worth working hard to figure out ways to sustain some of those basic norms that help us function. And I think in the last couple of years with misinformation, particularly, we've we've seen huge issue areas that are totally existential threats to like climate change, human trafficking. There's a host of them that where it's clear that social media platforms are flat Earth. Social media platforms are pushing content further than it should go, and making people question unnecessarily in ways that cost money and cost lives. Right? There's a couple studies out now about the number of people who did not take the COVID vaccine, and in their very last moments expressed that they regretted getting sucked into the anti-vax movement. So unfortunately, the impact of this stuff is becoming measurable, and that's that's another thing. That's another reason to get this IPIE up and going.
It's really interesting thinking about COVID within this case. I guess, and one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot over the last couple of years is that in a lot of these instances, you don't necessarily need to convince someone that your idea is right. You just have to introduce enough doubt that they feel uncomfortable in pursuing that decision, right? And so like it's a much lower bar. You say like, oh well, and you said it in your book, right? Like questions like, is the vaccine effective, or is it safe, right? Like, and
that's the prompt. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the prompt, and that gets people getting the question, right? And you maybe say, oh well, we see this response in 1 in 10,000 people, and and that's enough.
Some of this,
They know.
I think that's a great example. Some of what we're talking about is actually science literacy, right? So trying to not everybody understands probabilities, and if everybody really understood probabilities, nobody would ever buy a lottery ticket, right? Because that's the concept. Is nobody should be. You wouldn't have any problem with gambling, because that if everybody understood, there'd be no. If everyone understood probabilities, there'd be no gambling industry. So there's some of it is about education, but also trying to catch the players that take advantage of those lack of understanding about how these systems work. And as you said, Peter, it's about introducing the nugget of doubt. I would also say that there's plenty of the important aspects of the problem here that are not related to technology. And here's an example. Here in the UK, misinformation about COVID vaccines was targeted to immigrant communities. And we noticed over many months that vaccine uptake was not as good as the rest of the country. And this is a real problem, right? Because these are people who've newly moved to the UK, don't always speak English, are somewhat disconnected from public institutions. And it turns out that in part, the problem was very successful anti-vax marketing, part of which flowed over social media. But in part, the other part of the aspect of this is that the health system here is under such stress that when immigrants had questions, were uncertain about whether to take the vaccine, there was no neighborhood doctor to talk to. There was no local doctor's office that they were registered to. And if you're in a decent neighborhood, wealthy neighborhood, you can go to your doctor, your NHS office, and ask a few questions. If some communities are just chronically underserved. So if you get misinformation and there's no trusted source that you can double check stuff with, the library is closed, right? Or the newspaper is not very good, then you get this sort of compound effect. And it's that compound effect that has real implications for public life.
Yeah, that level of influence is pretty scary, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm feeling cynical, but not fatalistic about it all. So I do hope we can turn things around, and I think there are some things we can do constructive.
I'm going to be honest, Phil. So I have had serious skepticism about this whole system for a while, and then when I read your Lie Machine book was probably the first time I had a little bit of hope. So, thank you.
Good. Yeah, it's important to get everybody depressed and then build back up and try to restore that. That's a narrative arc.
Yeah. Can we focus a little bit on the program that you're launching? It sounds like you're going to have quite a few different kinds of resources to really just understand the problem more and then to build policy regulation. Can you kind of fill in the gaps of what your main initiatives are?
Certainly. So the IPIE, the International Panel on the Information Environment, will connect researchers who can help with this constructive mission about defining problems, evaluating the research on solutions, and getting succinct statements about what the solution set is to the regulators and the designers, the engineers who will actually implement. And in part, this is born out of a couple of years now of dissatisfaction doing testimonies of the Senate Select Committee on this and that, and trying to provide testimony to the Parliament's commissions here in Europe and the UK, trying to work with the technology firms themselves to understand what's going on their own platform. I think we're at a sensitive point now where public life is really frayed internationally, and there's a bunch of serious, complex humanitarian disasters that happen weekly that are exacerbated, made much worse because of misinformation, information operations.
Yeah.
So, if we can get good evidence about what's going on, deliver it in the right way to the policymakers, and there's some signs that policymakers are looking for evidence, right? They want to act, they're ready to regulate. A lot of governments have tried industry self-regulation for a couple of years now. We're past the point of industry self-regulation. So the trick is to not go too heavy, right? To keep it light, not stifle the creativity, but stop the nasty.
Yeah. Yeah, that's go ahead.
I just like with regulations like GDPR and in California, right? We have the CCPA. How do you feel about those? Like, is that a step in the right direction? Are those kind of meeting a lot of those needs? How has that kind of evolved over the last couple of years?
Well, I'm a mild GDPR fan. I do think it's done a fair amount to increase to raise the responsibility on organizations for managing the data that they have. I agree. There's a critique that all the cookies, that nobody reads the cookie things, and everybody at this point, everybody's just approving all the cookies all the time. But I do think the Commission has, of all the world's regulators, the European Commission does seem to be able to take inputs from civil society, consider some policies, and get something out on the books within a year or two. In the US context, it's hard to know which regulator will act in this way. It takes state-based legislation, like what California has done, or state attorney general's offices. Right. Those are the sources of potential reasonable protection. They'll always use language about protecting consumers, right, or protecting. New York's attorney general work to protect New York voters. They're not going to worry about the other citizens of the other states, but sometimes if California or New York or together do things, they will have an impact on the rest of the country. So it's challenging to know which regulators to work with when, but I think that's a good outlet for us. They are our audience.
Yeah, and I know from our side, right, with building machine learning models, right, we often have a higher bar for explainability of what sorts of data we're using, how that data is being processed, what data is protected, how we're going through that whole process here. And
can I ask you about that?
Yeah.
Can you say a little bit of what are the things you worked on? Like, I imagine that varies. It probably varies a little bit company to company, but it probably is also standardized somewhat by the law.
Yeah. So I can talk specifically about a couple projects that I've worked on here. For the most part, we just have to be very careful about how that data is handled, making sure that it's always behind like an encrypted systems. And then there are sets of data that are, like company names, individual names. All of the data in the environments that we get to work with is flagged as far as how private it is, if it's able to be used organizationally or publicly or privately. So we've seen a lot more on that side of things as far as a data, at least within the United States. And then with building models, there has been an increase. I mean, some of the first models I was building out, it was all just about the output. And now there's an increase to say, okay, well, how are these decisions being reached? Can you explain that and make sure that information is readily available to everyone who's using the model?
Okay, so don't reveal any deep firm secrets, but on the whole, do you think today's engineer has systems for tracking those inputs over time? Do they use an Excel spreadsheet and sort of put where they got each chunk of data, or is it sort of ad hoc and only when the company lawyer visits do you type up?
Probably the latter. I would say generally it's the latter. Yeah.
Okay. Right. It kind of depends. But yeah, mostly the latter.
Yeah. Not always, but yeah. And I think there's a big discrimination between like protecting data and regulating data, and then what is emerging. We've built some frameworks around, and I know there's several being developed between certainly Europe and the United States around how that are more qualitative in nature, where it's like, what is the risk and benefit both from the person who's being exposed to it and who's building it, right? Being able to assess that and say and lay it all out. And then, because I know that there's more regulation coming up the pipeline, particularly in Europe, around what you can and can't do relative to how you influence people, right? Which I think is going to be a really different and new era. And I don't know how the tech companies are going to respond to those types of regulations.
Right. But it is very interesting. So I was thinking about this within also the context of lie machines. Right. If we're working on making sure that the inputs to the models are very explainable, right? If we're having models that are making decisions, that those decisions need to be able to be audited by the end consumers. There's a whole nother aspect, right, of the machine learning, which is like targeting, like ad targeting, right? I don't know of regulations that are talking about, hey, you need to know how this ad is targeting you.
Right.
Which
you suppose the firms that run ad auction systems are supposed to be able to explain their ad auctions in some jurisdictions, and then I think here in the UK, and I think the European Union is considering auditing mandatory auditing for recommender systems. So and again, I think there's a lot of uncertainty about what that would look like or how you would run it, but yeah, it's challenging.
Yeah, I thought one of the interesting points you made about one of the things you thought would be really useful in sort of changing the tides is it's kind of like a numbers game to an extent. And one of the things you highlighted is actually increasing or having some set percentage of ads that are going out around like social announcements and things of that nature that are more public announcements and things which really
public service ads.
Yeah.
Yep.
Right. Yeah. Right. And so, and I know that's a little bit of a change of topic, but that kind of goes to the point of what's the objective. And if you're at least balancing out the objectives where it's like, okay, to make more money, to influence someone, to mislead someone, and then to, it feels a little bit like there's multiple layers to it, and one of it is to just try and at least balance the playing field.
Balance the field, exactly. I think that I don't think I'm really old-fashioned, but it's the idea that you might spend, 1 of every 10 commercials on TV would be a public service ad. That's from the 30s. That's from the 1930s, the 1940s, and um, I think there's some research. I believe the research suggests that it did help create a common thread of what day voting day was, where the polling station was, or whatever what vaccines were needed at what stage in life, and so expecting the 1 in 10, and I really just picked 1 in 10 out of the air. It's hard to know what the right number is, but it's some reasonable proportion of ad space could be dedicated to public service ads. That seems like a reasonable thing to implement, especially since the value of the ad operations is actually quite large, right? We know
Yeah,
we know the value that's generated by these companies.
yeah, for sure.
Hey,
Great.
am I allowed to ask for your advice? Ask a question of you two
Sure.
as we get close to close. So I've been engaged in a couple of debates about what security looks like at a cloud level, and for me, the thing we're actually talking about is whether territorialized data territoriality is good or bad in the context of a Swiss cloud. And so if we were going to do the work of the IPIE, does it matter is there some confluence of engineering and the law that is the super protective space for guaranteeing personal privacy and keeping organizational records safe?
Oh man, that's an interesting problem. I imagine the main complication is the fact that the laws differ based on the source, and you have to comply with both the source and the location, which is probably the most difficult piece to.
Right. Yeah, it does get into a much deeper conversation around data sovereignty and where that data is owned and regulated, and when that data crosses borders, how do the regulations change? Yeah, it does.
And will the company lawyer come and visit? Yeah.
Right. Because I know, like, we have specific countries that we can't work from. That based on the laws there, our data cannot cross into those countries. We can't use our VPNs from those countries. So you just can't get you can't log into company devices there.
Yeah, and we have some companies who can't distribute data to certain other countries because of their own.
And we have data, right, that can't move out of the UK or that can't cross international borders, right? Like if we're working for a client in the US, we can't use our servers in Canada, and vice versa. And so,
unless there's a VPN that connects at all.
No, even so, it matters where the data is stored, right? So Snowflake, AWS, Azure, they're going to have servers that are in various locations, in the US, in Canada, in Europe, and we have to make sure that we are using the specific servers that meet the standards based on our service agreements, based on the client's service agreements with their customers, and make sure that everything is being met there and that we're all aligned and agreed on that.
It's probably going to be a big policy mapping project, I would imagine, initially, to figure out.
Yeah, and we're some of the lucky ones, I think, because we do have people who work specifically in the privacy of data and can advise us internally on how to do that. So,
well, this is great. Thanks for a great conversation. I've learned a lot from you, so I think this is fabulous.
Yeah, thank you so much, Phil. It was really nice, and thank you everyone for listening.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks, Phil.
Bye.